All right. All right, so try number 2 on re-recording bee removals. So bee removals, this is going to be a pretty short section because it's good to know about them. It's not necessarily something I would push everyone to do, but there will probably be a certain subset of people that are really interested in pursuing them. I put this picture here because I actually have pulled 2 or 3 colonies of bees out of this courthouse down in Lee County. Everything about the level of the clock or above. So some kind of fun removals out of that. So overall, what are the requirements to do a bee removal in Texas? A lot of this is going to come back to Texas Apiary Inspection Service. So primarily, and this is really important, you have to be registered as a beekeeper with Texas Apiary Inspection Service. So if you go to their website, it's a pretty quick form to fill out. It's $35 per fiscal year. And by fiscal year, I mean it starts in September and goes to the next September. And this just registers you as a functioning beekeeper. And what it does is it legally bypasses a lot of those pest control requirements that you would otherwise have to do bee removals. So it's kind of a loophole, a legal one. And so very important that you're registered. And in addition to that, at the same kind of area, you fill out a bee removal statement application. So this is going to be free. You're going to update it yearly. And if you want, this is kind of a good side effect. If you want to be listed, Texas Apiary Inspection Service will list you as a registered beekeeper who does bee removals in whichever counties you'd want, unless you want to opt out of that. Overall recommendations, so those are the only real requirements. Overall recommendations, you should, I think, especially if you're doing structural removals, get some liability insurance. It just depends on how far you're going into that and how much you need. Having contracts, especially for these bigger paying jobs, especially for structural things where there probably is some liability involved, that can be important. And there are some professional organizations out there. Most of them are newer in Texas. There are the Texas Professional Bee Removers. I know they have a group. They're kind of a good source for creative ideas in how to pull bees out of structures, kind of show and tell, and also some recommendations for things. So what skills do you need to remove bees? It really depends on the removal you're looking at. These can vary really widely. So for one, you do need a certain number of, a certain level of beekeeping skill. I say that, but while there's definitely overlap between beekeeping skills and bee removal skills, there's definitely some different things about each also. So I know some folks that are really, really good bee removers, and they're also beekeepers, but maybe that's a secondary thing and vice versa. Once you get into structural removals, you need really a high level of construction knowledge and deconstruction knowledge. That's going to be, a lot of these folks are pretty much full-on contractors. Another thing to keep in mind is that the safety considerations for these things may be really significant on every side of it. So you got potential bee stings to the person who hired you, say the bees are in their home, or the public. So a lot of the time on bee removals, I've been at least partly responsible for making sure that none of the folks, walking by with baby strollers down that neighborhood's road got stung, right? So you have to really keep in mind the whole area that you're in there. There are definite hazards as far as structural removals and others for the property itself. So you can set fires, you can cut through an electric line, all kinds of things can happen there. And then personal safety. There are definite job risks associated with a lot of these removals. You can fall off ladders, get stung up by bees, all kinds of stuff. So just things to think about. So I'm going to start kind of with the lower end, the easier entry level kind of things that a normal just beekeeper might be able to do, and kind of go towards the more difficult. Like I said, these are bee removals come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, right? Um, all sorts of methods to do them. I'll kind of just go over broad categories. So the first and kind of the easiest normally is a swarm removal. So just like we just talked about swarms, here's a swarm embarrassingly on a car next to an apiary that I maintained, probably my fault. Looked like they probably got knocked down potentially in the storm the night before, or just settled on that car. Um, but this could be a very simple removal, right? You'd need maybe an empty nuke box, a bee brush, or just to go find the queen, move them into a box that way. A lot of beekeepers are going to be able to handle a swarm like this. Swarms can get tricky if they happen to be way up in a tree. Just ability to reach them can be a little harder. But overall, swarms can be pretty simple. Most of the time, these are free pickups because they are easy. But with swarms, you kind of have to be careful too, because like I talked about in swarming, they could be there a few minutes. So you could get the call, you could be on your way, and they could fly off, right? So there's always that risk. So a lot of beekeepers don't travel very far for a swarm, but if it's local, they'll go pick it up because it's pretty easy. So you're probably going to get swarm calls. Because people will know that you have bees. Anyone that knows that you have bees is probably going to tell their neighbor, their friends. Anyone that has a swarm is likely to get your number. So kind of have an idea of if you're going to take those calls or refer them elsewhere. If you want more of these, talk yourself up. You have honey clients, they're going to call you, right? Local bee groups, a lot of the time they'll have pages for this. So I know like in Brazos Valley, they have a full member site where if they get a swarm call, they put it out to the members, right? So they get first dibs on that swarm. Neighborhood pages are good ones. I know some folks that will have pest control companies that call them because they'll get a call about a bee swarm and they don't want to kill it. And so they'll have your number to call. So you can always up these if you want to, and go pick up a lot of swarms on a good year. And then we get into the simple removals that I think still most beekeepers are probably capable of. These are these entry point kind of removals to me, where it's not a swarm. A swarm is really a temporary thing anyway. With these simple removals, they have actually, the bees have decided to live there. They've set up shop. They've created their nest and expanded their colony normally. But these simple removals, normally they don't come with a lot of liability other than like the bee stings. As you, like I said, I've had, for example, on water meters to kind of keep kids on bikes a little bit further away so they don't get stung while I'm removing these little water meter bees. A lot of these are going to be in small and or really well-contained spaces where they're really confined. A lot of the tricky part of things like structural removals is that bees can definitely sort of abandon the comb, especially if you do it wrong, but even if you don't, and they can kind of run further to an inaccessible point to find them. Whereas something like on this top right picture, that water meter, that's a pretty defined space. That queen can end up in a wad of bees in the corner, but she's not going to be able to really go anywhere else unless she flies. And so it's a pretty definite, you can get all these bees. For something like a water meter, that's normally probably a lower paid job. Kind of just depends on where you are. Some people will do these for free because, like I said, they are pretty straightforward. But sometimes they'll be $75, maybe up to $100, $150, depends on the city, depends on how much of a rush it is. You kind of have to set your price on these things if you're going to charge, and just charge according to how much it's worth it to you. So with a water meter, you could still do it with very minimal equipment. You could have a nuke box and a queen clip, and maybe a bucket to throw extra honeycomb in, right? Or you could have the whole bee remover get up with a bee vac and all sorts of elaborate stuff and do it a little bit quicker. But that's going to be a pretty simple one. The picture on the top left, that's an owl box, I think. There are duck boxes also that look pretty similar. But you can kind of tell. So that's just a contained box for owl nesting that the bees found first. You can tell bees have actually lived in it because it's kind of hard to see in that shadow. But if you look at the big hole in that box, it's pretty well covered in propolis. So those bees didn't really appreciate how big that entrance was. They wanted to narrow it down. Um, but that's a really simple one. And a lot of these things too, you can just, like with that owl box, you can just unscrew, seal it up in some way, screen it off, tape it off, unscrew it from its post, and drive it away. You'll hear of a lot of bees setting up in small composters in a backyard or barbecue pits, things like that. A down log that you could cut a bit of and seal off. So these are things you can just pick up. This bottom right picture, that is actually a fuel tank off of a very large old car. It was sitting in this lady's backyard, full of bees. As you can tell there, Steve has taped it up. He's screened off a couple of entrances so they don't overheat, but it had a whole lot of rusted out spots. So we pretty much sealed all the bees in there that we could. We picked it up, we put it on the back of my truck bed, and I took it to the house and removed them later when I had plenty of time. So easy peasy. Like I said, some of these jobs you might take on for free. Some of them might be paid jobs, but you really don't need a whole lot of equipment. You're not, cutting into anyone's house. There's just a little less liability for everyone involved. This one kind of fits into that same category. So I think I talked about in swarming earlier that occasionally bees will not find a nesting cavity that's acceptable to them. They won't even find one that's a little less acceptable. And so sometimes where bees bivouac, or even they may even move to do this, they'll end up forming what's called an open air hive just outside of a cavity, usually on a tree branch, but they can be elsewhere, eaves of a house, that kind of thing. They normally do form where they have some sort of cover over the top of them like this. So this is an example of an open air hive. This can be pretty simple because there's not anything to cut through to get to them, right? So here I am at the top of a ladder. I've got a smoker in that bucket, but these were actually really nice bees. It was a pretty decent sized colony in a little neighborhood in Austin. And they probably would have filled about a single deep box, and I probably would have wanted to put another one on them pretty quick if you were to kind of estimate this colony size. Really gentle bees, surprisingly. You never know till you get up there. But here I am, I'm just taking a bee vac. I'm vacuuming bees off of the surface of combs, and then I'll take just a cheap knife and cut comb. And normally, in my case, I get rid of a lot of the honeycomb by, not get rid of, but I put in a bucket. I don't necessarily keep that on the bees it came from. Because it's just really, really fragile, especially if it's hot out there, and it's really hard to band into combs. If I get to a good brood frame, maybe I will cut that and use rubber bands to fix it into a frame. But overall, that's the process on these. So pretty simple. But the problem with open air hives is similar to your problem occasionally with swarms, and that even though they're usually straightforward, they can come with some risks too. So this one was at the top of, not all the way extended, but that's a 28-foot ladder. So they're up there. You're kind of blowing in the breeze with limbs. So I'm okay with heights. I can tell you that Tara Rosecrans was helping me that day, and she's a little less okay with heights, but she's better at structural removals than me. And so you kind of have to pick your poison on these. Like, is this too much setup for the normal beekeeper? Probably, but again, if you're helping out someone who's much more experienced, I should probably be wearing a harness in this, right? You kind of decide what you want to do with these. So kind of moving on then into places that are not really structural necessarily, removals where you're not really deconstructing anything, but you can't access them. Or if to access them, you'd have to kill them. So a living tree, for example. A lot of folks with bees and trees, they don't want to kill the tree, right? They want to move the bees on, but they don't want to kill the tree. And other inaccessible places. So think of things like a rock wall, or sometimes bees will even set up in things like metal, like the pipe fencing. Usually that goes poorly for them about August in Texas, but they'll still do it. So things you can't cut your way into, or you wouldn't want to. But things where there's not really a problem leaving a little bit of comb and stuff behind, where if you leave comb and some dead brood behind in a tree, you're not too worried about, the comb melting down and dripping gross honey and having pests move in, because this is a tree cavity, not the side of your house, right? So I'll start with trap outs. Trap outs, just in my experience, can be almost like a dirty word with bee removal specialists. Not with everyone, but everyone has a pretty strong opinion on them, I'd say. So the reason being, trap outs are really, they take a long time. They take a lot of little manipulation to get done. So not saying they're a bad method, but they definitely, they take a while. They take some dedication. I would probably recommend, if you're going to do a trap out, that for one, it is actually something that a beekeeper would probably be more likely to have the time for, kind of. But probably in, like, say, your neighbor's yard, or somewhere where you're going to be by a lot anyway. Otherwise, it's really hard to charge for your time on these sometimes, because they are high input. They take actual weeks. What a trap out does, and you can kind of tell by this large amount of structure attached to this tree in this picture, they utilize a one-way funnel. So think of a bee escape. We don't use those a lot down here, but they exist. They use a one-way funnel. So every time a forager bee leaves that nest, they can't get all the way back into the brood nest. And then they also have what's called a decoy hive. So if you look in that kind of homemade scaffolding they've put beside the tree, that's a decoy hive. So what you're trying to do is lure everyone out into that hive. Now, a lot of folks that have bees in their wall, they want to say, can I just put a hive out there and put honey in it, or put something interesting in it, and have bees move in? And it's like, well, if they live in a tree, they're not moving out. You really have to make things bad in that tree for them to want to move out. In this case, that one-way funnel basically makes it to where they can't get back to where they want to go, into the brood nest. And so they're stuck kind of utilizing that decoy hive. So there's a straight shot. They can't get back to the nest, but they have to go through that decoy hive. You can just siphon off foragers slowly. That's what a lot of trap out people end up really doing. Done right, though, you're trying to get that queen out and some of those younger bees, right? This is actually a really well done trap out. So even though it looks a little rough, that black plastic, so the first step you have to do with a trap out, you have to find the entrance. And if there are multiple entrances, you have to locate all those and cover them. And that's what that trash bag is doing. They're covering any little bit of light that might come through. Because if you cover a primary entrance and there's either another one or another little bit of light coming through, those bees are going to try their best to make another entrance. So what you're doing there is you're covering that entrance with that one-way funnel, basically, and that decoy hive. So now the only entrance to there is through the decoy hive. You're pulling foragers out, and I have to say, in Texas, a lot of the things that might actually help you are normally considered negative things. So you're starving out that queen and that brood nest over time. You're pretty quickly probably starving them of pollen. The reason I can't tell you how long these take is because you don't know how much honey is in there. But basically because the foragers can't get back to her, and can't get back to those young bees in the actual brood nest, you're slowly starving them. In Texas, especially in kind of the more humid areas of Texas, things like small hive beetles will actually help this process. It sounds bad, but as you get fewer and fewer bees in the brood nest, you start having pests like hive beetles take over. You don't have enough of those forager bees coming back, and you don't have enough new bees being raised to really protect it. And as I talked about in absconding, hive beetles can actually make a hive abscond. And so I have a feeling in a lot of these, especially, from May, June, July, August, you're going to have hive beetles probably almost convincing those bees to abscond and actually getting your queen out. So the goal here is to get that queen out eventually. In that decoy hive, you can add and probably recommended to add a frame of developing brood once you kind of have some foragers captured in there. That might help your queen kind of eventually come out. But that's a trap out. Like I said, they're a whole process. They can be fun to figure out, but there's a lot of kind of small manipulations you have to do to finally get it right, right? The other thing you can do, and this is more, I'd say, what a lot of bee removers are going to lean towards, for these places that you can't access, that you're not worried about leaving behind old comb, like this brick wall in this picture, you can do what's called a forced abscond. Like I said, I talked about in absconding just a little bit that a lot of disturbance will actually eventually make bees leave their nest. Like you have to make it really bad in there, but there is a certain level at which bees will leave their nest. These are far quicker than a trap out, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily quick. So I've been involved in forced absconds that took 30 minutes and a queen walked out. And then I've been sitting under a tree for 8 or 9 hours. And so when you arrive, you don't really know. A lot of it has to do with how that air and smoke is moving around in there that we'll talk about in a second. It takes some patience sometimes. It takes really a lot of skill. I've mentioned Steve Butler earlier. He's the bee remover that I've tagged along with on a lot of bee removals. He is the expert. I'm the one that was learning and making sure no one fell off a ladder. But this is kind of his specialty, and he's very, very good at a forced abscond. I'll show you a video of that next. So a lot of the time, especially say in a living tree, if there aren't a lot of holes accessible, you're going to be drilling holes. So for example, in a tree, you're going to be trying to guess where that cavity inside that tree is. Almost any big tree out there has an empty cavity inside. I never knew that until I started doing these. So you're trying to get kind of above and below it and utilizing the entrance too. And drilling a small hole that's not necessarily going to hurt that tree long term, probably 3/4 of an inch, 7/8, something in there. And you're applying smoke and volatiles. And the way you're doing this, it's kind of almost like a push and a pull method. So you kind of start out with pushing those bees. You push them with smoke out of your smoker. A lot of folks will use a blower, like a little shop blower that actually pushes that smoke a little harder. And then they're going to use things like repellents, although I still have a typo in here, can't spell repellents. But so repellents, think about things that will clear honey super, like honey robber, Bee Quick. So that will be a very pretty strong push, those kind of repellents. Another thing that some folks like to use, especially Steve, is tea tree oil. So tea tree oil is a essential oil type thing. You can get it places like Walmart or pharmacies. And he will actually put that on a smoker fuel. So it's coming out as smoker. And that one, it's a volatile, but it's a little heavier. It kind of sits towards the bottom of that air cavity. And that's a pretty good push for them too. At the same time, you got these different pulls on the other side of things because you're wanting them all to come out. For one, if you look at that picture, you've got a big cluster of bees there. You actually want a big cluster of bees. I always kind of joke that bees have gravity. The bigger the cluster of bees you get, the more attractive they are to the rest of the bees. And so you kind of let them cluster up. They're going to be doing things like releasing Nazanov's pheromone. They're just going to generally smell like home at a certain point once there's enough confusion out there. Once the queen comes out, she's obviously also a very big draw, especially for those younger bees. Lemongrass oil is another one. Lemongrass oil, just a touch will do. I can tell you there's probably some on the frame that's sitting above that cluster. Lemongrass oil mimics Nazanov's pheromone, which is again that kind of come hither orientation pheromone that's real volatile. And so that's a good way to pull them. And so the way these things work is you blow smoke. You have to be real careful because if you blow too much smoke too quick, what those bees are going to do is kind of just wad up in a corner and die. You're never going to get your queen out. If you don't put enough smoke, they're not actually going to be pushed out. And so it takes a lot of skill to kind of do this just right. And the queen, she can come out very first, she can come out very last. You have to kind of just keep watching both the entrance that they were already using, but also the holes you've drilled or found and look for the queen there. Or you can have, like we had on one really large live oak tree with a whole lot of holes in it. We looked and looked and looked for the queen, and she'd flown out the top that we couldn't even get to and ended up on my veil. Had a wad of bees on my veil in the back. So she could be anywhere, but that's what you're watching for. Once you have her, you can kind of push them harder, get everyone out that's going to come out, and then wrap that up. And this is a little video of Steve just demonstrating. This is how he did this particular tree. They're, like I said, they're all different. Takes just a lot of skill. I'll play that real quick.
Removal on the tree today, and Jacob's up on the tree on the ladder with the smoker and a blower. And we've got a hole drilled up above here and one drilled below the nest. And so the idea is to smoke them up from the top and push them down. And then we've put some repellent in that hole there on the top. And then we're forcing them out this hole in the bottom to smoke them on out. Now, this tree has a lot of holes. And if you walk around and look at this side, you can see we got a cluster going on this dead part up here. So we've got to watch for the queen over there, where she could very likely be over there. And we have to watch for the queen in this cluster that we have coming out here. So let's pause it for a little.
So yeah, every tree is different. So in this example, he's pushing most of them down, whereas sometimes you're pushing more of them up. I don't know whether she ended up popping out the top or the bottom of this one later. But yeah, they're all kind of a puzzle. And on to structural removals. Structural removals vary very widely as far as their difficulty. So on the easier side are things you don't have to be on a tall ladder for one. Things like soffits tend to be easier, but even those can be trickier than you think. A soffit normally is a fairly contained space, but sometimes they're not. In this picture here, this is a removal. Actually, I think I did this one on my own. I can tell you that this is kind of the porch and also a floor and also about the third addition to this house. And so it was a very complicated kind of a colony just to get to. And this one went really well. You can tell they're all kind of bunched up there, clustered, pretty happy. But this is a perfect example of one. If you went in with a lot of smoke, or if those bees were just kind of more easily agitated bees, you can easily push those further down that floor joist or whatever that is, and they'll just end up in an inaccessible place and be a problem for you. Or set up another colony, which is exactly what you don't want further in. So structural removals, they can be costly. They can have this bigger liability risk attached. So, you kind of, even really experienced bee removers are gonna vet these pretty well before they price one out, before they even accept it. These can be any number of things. So in general, the other thing about a structural removal is you're opening it up because you really want to get that comb out of there. So in this example, this was a rock wall. I really hate masonry work. So this is Steve again with his hammer drill there. But we really pretty much had to open it up because on the other side of that wall, where we could have gone through sheetrock, something like that, there was actually a bathtub. So outside of pulling the whole bathtub out to get these bees out, you pretty much had to go through this rock wall. But in these kind of removals, you really want to, in structural removals overall, your big goal is not just to get the colony of bees out, but you really want to get that comb out, because say they just hired a pest control company to come spray these bees. If they even manage to kill them, you're going to have just really gross, rotting dead brood in your walls and rotting dead bees. Hive beetles might move into that honey and make it kind of just run out the baseboards. So it's going to be a big nasty mess potentially, especially behind a little less insulation than this in the summer. But this one, luckily, Steve has the construction skills, so he could get to them. I could kind of pull out bees and then he could close it up like it never happened. But definitely a little bit trickier to get to. So a really important part of bee removals is you want to prevent future removals, right? Like the whole point of this is that these bees are in a bad spot. You don't want them to get right back there. So step one, if you're in the case of a structural removal where you're opening things up, you want to take all that comb out, You want to scrape down the walls. I've even seen people that'll take like a rubberized paint and paint over where that comb was. Um, Despite all this, and even though that's a really good idea to make sure and get all this off, scrape it down, that smell of that wax and that smell of propolis will attract future swarms. So you just have to know that's always going to be a bit of a bee magnet. And because of that, if this is a cavity, you stuff that cavity. Bees are looking for a cavity to nest in, and so going in there and making it to where there is none is really the primary deterrent for future bees. They might be able to find another hole, but you don't want to move them right back into that same cavity. So a lot of the time, we just use this for things like walls. We'll just use that. I think it's R13, the fiberglass insulation. Over time, now granted that that's going to kind of compress and degrade a little bit, and so it's not a bee removals are never a 30-year warranty, right? But you definitely do your best to stuff that cavity with something, and then seal the entrances really well. Bees can get through your 1/4-inch hardware cloth, so you got to go 8th inch or less. You can also use things like they sell rolls of aluminum screening for like screen doors. You can even get this at like Walmart. You don't even have to go Home Depot. And that's really good you can both stuff that into things. You can kind of wad it up. It's really malleable, but you can kind of stuff entrances with that, especially entrances that aren't a perfect square or perfect circle. Caulking things, but find a way to really seal those entrances. Don't think that spray foam is going to do it. That's kind of like the first indicator of a poor bee removal a lot of the time. Not 100% of the time, but you'll just see spray foam everywhere. Don't do that. They can eventually get through it unless it's a really specialized kind. And then lastly, setting up your removal bees. Most of the people that are going to call you about a bee removal, paying or not, but especially paying, a lot of the time they're doing it to do right by the bees. And they really don't have to do this. It's probably the best solution in a lot of ways, because a bee remover isn't going to leave bees in their walls that are, just dead bees in their walls. But a lot of folks want to do right by the bees, and so you kind of want to make sure that if you can set those bees up for success, that you do, right? So setting up removal bees, you can kind of see on this frame that Steve's holding here, those kind of bits that are dangling off, that's old rubber band. So this is one where he did cut comb and actually band it into that frame. You can kind of tell it's, I think it's upside down and a little bit wonky. So eventually I tend to get rid of these frames, but they're a really good way to start, because if that brood isn't dead, you can kind of keep the bees on their own brood and set them up that way. Now, some people will have a yard that they take removal bees just to quarantine them. It's not a bad idea, especially if you're in a removal where you can see the brood comb and you've got anything going on there. Definitely a good idea to have a quarantine yard. Not everyone does, but it's a good thought. And just know that these, a lot of the time, a lot of them are going to be a little smaller colonies. You're going to have destroyed most of their comb. Honestly, it's just not always possible to maintain and keep much of their comb, especially if it's hot and they've got a lot of honey. That's just going to melt down and be really, really easy to just disintegrate, basically, as you're taking it out. Even if they're not small, though, they're pretty stressed. They've been through a big event, right? And so what a lot of the time, the best thing to do is, if you can go into other colonies with frames of brood bees, not even necessarily bees if you got enough removal bees, but frames of brood, frames with a little bit of food on them. If you can donate a frame or two from a normal colony to that removal colony, you're way ahead of the game. And then combine these removal bees if you need to. So say you have 2 water meter hives and it's getting a little late in the year, pick a queen you like. Maybe you can use that other queen somewhere else, but combine those bees, try to get them to where they can actually make a living in time. And also, as you're doing these removals, decide if those queen genetics are something you want, because a lot of folks will think that if it's a removal, that these are feral bees. They may be, they may not be. They may be the Italian hive down the road swarmed. We've definitely found marked queens in bee removals. I've I've heard of people finding clipped and marked queens in bee removals. So they're not necessarily survivor stock. They might be. A lot of people want to use survivor stock in kind of their apiaries, and not a bad idea necessarily, but you want to kind of take it with a grain of salt. If you're pulling bees out of a wall, out of a water meter, it doesn't mean they've lived there forever. Doesn't mean that they, you know, are these feral genetics. And on the other side of feral genetics, are they really mean? Do they have other things that you don't want? So you might end up requeening a lot of these colonies. I've definitely found good ones though. Like I said, it's just a matter of kind of vetting them as you go. And then last little bit, don't really need to know this whole list because this is not the whole list. Um, if you're going into bee removals in any big way, you have to have pretty much everything a regular beekeeper would have, your smoker, your hive tool, your suit, and then you have to have everything else. So I can tell you one reason I didn't do more bee removals is because I was doing a lot of beekeeping, and there's a finite amount of truck space at a certain point because the bee removals take a lot of different things potentially. So you need ladders, a bee vacuum. I know that was put in the comments. One of the Texas bee vac guys that has a good one. You can make your own out of a shop vac top, put on something. So all a bee vac does is it kind of gently vacuums the bees to where they won't be exploded, and pulls them through kind of a screened hive area where they don't get back into the vacuum. And so you've captured your bees. Thermal cameras, those are really helpful, especially if it's cool enough outside. If it's already 95 degrees outside and you're looking for a warm spot, it's probably not going to help. Borescopes, generators, a lot of the time you're not going to be near something you can plug in, and just so many tools. So many tools. I think part of the bee removers kind of idea a lot of the time is they'll do a bee removal, they'll get the money for it, and then they'll go and buy more tools to do more bee removals. I swear that's how it works. So not with everybody, but it's definitely a thing. So a whole lot of things you could potentially go with. And then I just wanted to end on this picture. So this video. This is just a knot hole in a tree that we were doing a forced abscond on. The queen doesn't come out in this, but it's just kind of to show generally how bees are moving when they're coming out of those forced absconds. I thought it was kind of a fun thing to watch. All right, and that's the end of bee removal. So thank you for watching.